Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Presented today by ServPro. Jam-packed, two great guests. Before we're done, we'll check in with Connor Riley. Last night's national championship game, what does it mean for Georgia? Connor was in the building. He'll give us some insight on that. Also coming up, Jake Fromm. Now, normally we go Connor first, Jake second. Today we're going to go Jake first, Connor second. Jake Fromm, will talk to him about everything else going on around Georgia football here right now and just how close Georgia perhaps is to getting back into the game that maybe you watched on TV last night. Also, in addition to that, I tell you, and this is not what many of you want to hear, but it is my honest, genuine feelings. I'm going to say them anyway. I feel pretty good about Georgia right now. Last night's game, I thought was pretty entertaining. Impressed with Ohio State. Notre Dame fought hard. They made it kind of fun to watch up until just about the very end of the game. And yet at no point in time while I was watching that game last night did I hang my head in shame, did I gnash my teeth. At no point in time last night did I ever say, man, my team is just doomed because look at the quality of football being played right here. Didn't say that. And I don't think you have reason to say that. I'm not trying to make my case as to why that is on today's show. And based on yesterday's conversation and the fact that some of that still continues, whether, Georgia needs to make massive coaching changes and things like that, in the midst of the divide among some fans right now, perhaps I have a little bit of a form of compromise maybe. We'll tell you more about that here coming up too. Glad to have you with us. It's freezing cold, so as you bundle up and try to stay warm, we appreciate you bringing us with you along the way. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I begin today with a confession. Did go to the game last night. Got home very late, so you're already talking about a little bit of a sleepless night. My wife also had some car trouble this morning, so I'm pretty bleary-eyed here today. Sometimes the day after the national championship game, you sort of feel that way. Many of you, perhaps the same type of deal where if you're like me, you go to bed far earlier on most nights than the national championship game allows you the chance to. And when it's your own team, Georgia, winning, listen, that sleepless night feels pretty good. When it's just two teams you don't have any kind of emotional connection to, perhaps not quite so much. So a little bleary-eyed here today. And yet, even in the midst of all of that, I find myself in a pretty good mood here today. I find myself feeling pretty optimistic about the topic we always address, which is what's coming next for the Georgia Bulldogs. And just to sort of start off with, when it comes to the national championship, honestly, hats off to both teams. Notre Dame fought pretty hard in this game. I wondered if they'd have the ability to keep it close. And during the game, you sort of wondered if they were going to be able to keep it close. And for the most part, they kind of did. Now, ultimately, Ohio State, did cover the spread pretty cleanly there at the end. But Notre Dame kind of took the lead to begin with, kind of fought back. Notre Dame did its part to make the game worth watching last night, so hats off to the Irish on that. And in the case of Ohio State, don't like saying this, don't take pleasure in this, but I would say it is true. This year, Ohio State was the best team in America. The right team, I believe, probably won the national championship. And honestly, I don't know that I would have given as much credit to last year's national champion, Michigan, as I'm willing to give to Ohio State here right now. That, the ornery part of me, whatever self-serving part of me, I don't know that I would be quite willing to concede that Michigan a year ago really was better than Georgia, really was the best team in America. Don't know that I would have wanted to do that. But this year, I'm more than happy to say I believe that Ohio State is probably the best team in America, and I believe the right team for this year probably won the national championship. It was certainly a remarkable run for Ohio State through the postseason, blowing out Tennessee, easily handling Oregon, beating Texas, and then ultimately winning the national championship game against Notre Dame. That was quite a run. But the reason why I'm in a good mood today, though, is because when you look at the team that is going to finish the season as the national champion, and as we oftentimes do, when you use that as the mirror to see the reflection of Georgia, the measuring stick to sort of see how far Georgia is from where it wants to be, I got to tell you, I don't hang my head here today. I don't I don't sit here saying, boy, Georgia is just so far away from glory. And Ohio State has got things figured out in a way that Georgia just doesn't. I don't feel that way today. I really don't. Some of you do because you're kind of heavy into the evaluation of Mike Bobo and Stacey Searles and kind of some of that kind of stuff. And as we said yesterday, we're going to give platform to that. We're going to give Georgia fans a chance to have their say and share their opinion when it comes to that type of deal. But I do think context is important. And I think last night's game provided some really interesting context for you. First of all, we judged Georgia harshly on the basis of bad performances. They looked really bad against Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl. They had a bad game, for instance, against Ole Miss. That our harsh evaluation of Georgia when that comes on the basis of some bad performances that Georgia had. But last night's national champion, who I think pretty clearly, as I mentioned a moment ago, the best team in America, it also had a really bad performance too. It lost twice, but one of those games was a really bad performance. In its own stadium, as a 20-point favorite against a hated rival, it lost to Michigan. So I think that's important context, that as we kind of grade Georgia harshly on the basis of a really bad performance in its most recent game against Notre Dame, keep in mind that Ohio State fans were doing that a few weeks ago themselves, and they were saying, this is you need to fire Ryan Day, you need to move on, kind of change everything, completely restructure the program. It was a very fatalistic conversation in Columbus just after that loss to Michigan, and then boom, a few weeks later, and now you're winning a national championship. And so that's one of the things I think you got to keep in mind here, is that the team that won it also had a bad moment. So be careful not making too much out of Georgia's bad moment against Notre Dame, the most recent game that Georgia played. Just be careful not making too much out of that, because good teams have a way of coming back from bad moments. Buckeyes did. Perhaps in 2025, Georgia can too. But to sort of put, I guess, a little bit of a finer point on this for a moment, another reason why I'm pretty optimistic about Georgia, now that we can officially, 2024 season is over, you can officially turn the page to 2025. Pretty optimistic about Georgia. One of the things I love, and I think I told you this yesterday, and I've told you this plenty throughout the years, are these way too early top 25s when you start saying, what does the national media think about your team, the team we talk about here? What do they think about them for the upcoming season? And I'll tell you, we talked about one of the ones from On3 yesterday. We're going to do ESPN here in just a moment. But for me, there is something really interesting contained within ESPN's ranking of Georgia in its way too early top 25. If you're curious, Georgia comes in at number 5. But beyond that, sometimes it's the caption of what the writer says about your team, in this case Georgia, that's as interesting as the ranking or anything like that. And this is where I think we can get to a little bit of a compromise. If you're a Georgia fan that's just so irritated because you only scored 10 points against Notre Dame, or because of the offensive regression, the stats that I labeled yesterday that kind of demonstrate that. If you're so irritated about all that you demand change, you want to see somebody kind of take responsibility for that, you want to see some accountability for all of that, perhaps you may not get your way to the full extent that you want to. And frankly, if we put 100 Georgia fans in the room, there'd be kind of a difference of opinion on what kind of the response to the disappointment of this season's end actually should be. There is some disagreement about Georgia fans about what the right, perspective is on the fact that the preseason number 1 Georgia did not finish, among the highest rated teams here this season. But while there might be some disagreement there, and while people who want to see so-and-so fired and this happen and that happen, while they may not all get what they want, can we at least take some sort of comfort in, or perhaps find some sort of compromise in, that everybody seems to agree on what the problem is? That there may be disagreement about the solution, but everybody seems to agree about the nature of the problem. And y'all, this is more meaningful than you perhaps realize. If you ever watch a show, for instance, like, say, the Paul Feinbaum show or something like that, one of these kind of what I think of as sort of like survey-type shows, they don't dive as deep on the topic of Georgia football or SEC football as we do. They sort of float above the surface. It's sort of like quarterbacks and coaches. That's the only names you ever hear mentioned on a Feinbaum show. If they're talking about Georgia, they were talking about Carson Beck, and they were talking about Kirby Smart, And that's really about as deep as it goes. You don't get into like lines of scrimmage. You don't talk about offensive line. That's just not the level of depth the average kind of regional or national conversation gets into when it comes to Georgia. So the problems that we would all identify for Georgia, a lot of times the more broad-based national media types, they don't quite realize, or maybe perhaps they don't just give a lot of voice to, the more granular aspects of Georgia football that we kind of fixate on all the time. But in the write-up about Georgia in the way too early top 25 at ESPN.com, which you can read this morning for yourself, Mark Schlabach, who is a good writer and a sharp guy, he does get into more detail on some of this kind of stuff than you're typically used to seeing the sort of national type person be. And once again, a lot of disagreement among Georgia fans about what the solution to Georgia's problems are, but you ought to take some comfort in the fact that everybody, whether it be person deep within the bubble of DawgNation here or kind of outside on the periphery national media type, everybody seems to identify exactly what Georgia needs more of going forward. I thought that Schlabach said it well. Let me show this on the screen. I'm going to read this to you. So Georgia comes in at number 5, the way too early ESPN top 25 here for 2025. Schlabach writes that the Bulldogs seemed a bit disjointed throughout much of the 2024 season. We would say, yeah, that probably seems right. But Schlabach says they still won an SEC championship, and they reached the college football playoff for the 4th time in the past 8 seasons. Gunnar Stockton played well in his first start. He's going to go into the offseason the front runner to place Carson Beck, who obviously left for Miami. Now, this is where I think if you're a Georgia fan who's really angry right now because you feel like your offense did not play well against Notre Dame, and if it had played better, you might could have been in the game last night or something like that. This is where I think you take some comfort here. This is what Schlabach, writing as a sort of a national guy for ESPN, he says, Georgia has got to do a better job of blocking up front, catching the football, and tackling on defense. He says, this is Schlabach writing, it's time for Kirby Smart to get back to the basics. That's the challenge that ESPN gives to Georgia. You guys got to get back to the basics. Now, he mentions defense and tackling. For the most part, I thought the defense kind of did its job this year, although admittedly there's room for improvement on that. But the energy for Georgia fans right now is around the two other things that Schlabach mentions. Blocking up front and catching the football, just essentially being kind of more explosive in the passing game. Those are the two things that Schlabach says offensively you need more of, and you got to get back to the basics to get that done. I would say if you're a Georgia fan who's been kind of bothered by, kind of the way that your season came to an end, the fact that somebody like Schlabach there at ESPN is talking about your offensive line issues, talking about your wide receiver drop issues, talking about that kind of back to basics type fundamentals, that's a national outlet identifying the same problems you feel like you have seen too, which perhaps would lead you to believe that there is agreement on kind of what held Georgia back. And even if many of us anyway, disagree about the solution to those problems, everyone seems to be on the same page with the fact that those problems exist. I think you got to take that seriously. Now, the man that's sort of public enemy number one for many of you is Mike Bobo, but Bobo himself also seems to be aware of these particular issues, the drops, the problems with the offensive line. Bobo himself seems to acknowledge that as a problem too. In fact, if you want to go back to when we were in New Orleans just prior to the Sugar Bowl, we had a chance to hear from Mike Bobo. And he was asked directly, have you ever been a part of a team that's had so many drops? And Schlabach says, listen, if you're Georgia and you keep having all these drops, you got to get back to basics. Well, when Bobo talked in New Orleans prior to the Sugar Bowl, he kind of defined his own idea of what maybe back to basics meant when it comes to that sort of thing. This is a Bobo from New Orleans.
I think you've coached long enough. You've gone through things in your career that happens, whether sometimes it's fumbles, sometimes it's interceptions, drop passes. You want to continue to coach the fundamentals of whether it's if you're fumbling the ball, how to carry the ball properly. And the specific question that you answered about dropping the ball, it's the fundamentals of 2 eyes, 2 hands, seeing it, catching the ball, catching the ball, focus on catching the ball and getting it tucked. Sometimes it becomes a confidence thing, kind of like my putting. If I'm missing the short putts, then I overthink it and then I can't make a short putt. But, just the routine of catching ball, day in and day out of what you do at practice. Obviously, we've tried to catch more balls, whether it's jugs, whether it's throwing to guys, throwing to each other, whether it's, quarterbacks throwing them extra balls. But repetition is the mother of all skills. So we're going to continue to rep catching that ball, getting it tucked, and, building that confidence in practice that'll lead to game day.
Now, in addition to that, Bobo, the work he says they're doing to kind of alleviate the drops and just sort of be better when it comes to the cohesion of the passing game, as Schleybaugh points out, you've also got the massive issue when it comes to, as Mark described it, blocking up front. But as we've said, like big-time offensive line issues where, it certainly seemed like at times the 2024 Georgia offensive line probably underperformed in a way that was almost shocking in the Kirby Smart era. I think it was probably Smart's least productive offensive line, at least going back to his first year in 2016, I believe. And, that is kind of the dark cloud that hangs over the rest of this conversation of any kind of improvement in any other aspect of the offense might not matter as much if the offensive line does not get better. And obviously one of the ways in which the offensive line struggle sort of showed up was this year Georgia really couldn't run the ball at times at all. Like this was, once again, about the least productive Kirby Smart rushing attack that we've maybe ever seen. And Schleybaugh points that out matter-of-factly at ESPN.com while also ranking Georgia number 5 overall for next season. And once again, to go back to Mike Bobo, this was also an issue that he was willing to own and admit when he spoke a few days ago. Let's hear Mike Bobo one more time.
Obviously, it is frustrating. We pride ourselves on being able to run the ball. I could sit here and give you, a lot of reasons, but all they'd be is excuses, point blank. You could sit here and say injuries, you can say this, but bottom line is excuse. We got to be able to run the ball if we want to continue to win in these playoffs. I think the second half of that Texas game, we said, hey, one of the big things I said at halftime, I said, hey, we're not just going to go out there and throw the ball. We got to get balanced and we got to run the football. And I think those backs and those linemen took ownership in that and played hard and blocked for those guys, and we broke some tackles. We got to find ways to move the ball on the ground.
So you hear Bobo say that and talking about the issue with the drops. You read what Schleybaugh writes. No one's disputing right now, including me, no one's disputing that Georgia has some significant problems. But those significant problems also come within the context of the biggest voice out there in national media, ESPN, is also ranking Georgia 5th for the upcoming season in its way to really top 25. And the teams ranked ahead of Georgia are Notre Dame at 4, Penn State at 3, Texas at 2, Ohio State at 1. And let me ask you this, and I mean this not rhetorically, I mean this legitimately. Are any of those teams that are ranked ahead of Georgia according to ESPN right now, are you afraid of any of those teams? Like really? Legitimately? Notre Dame, to its credit, beat Georgia. And I'm not here to diminish the value of that win for Notre Dame. But as you watch the Irish do that in New Orleans and as you watch them play last night, do you see some sort of team that just sort of like fathoms better than UGA? I hope you don't, because I would say that you've misunderstood the nature of the sport if you do. Penn State was a team that prior to the playoff, most Georgia fans were hoping to get the chance to play. Are we now to believe that they're somehow way ahead of UGA as well for the upcoming season? Once again, I think the answer to that question is probably no. Texas is ranked 2nd. The other poll we had yesterday ranked number 1. As you know, Georgia beat them twice this past season. So the idea that the sky is falling for UGA after a season in which it beat a team like Texas multiple times, given the expectations for Texas next year, once again, it's just more appropriate context for the challenges that Georgia's facing. And then Ohio State did win the national championship. They ranked number 1 here for a reason, but there's also a really good chance that Ohio State on the field next year looks far different than it does right now. I'm not saying they take a step back, but there will be plenty of new faces on the field for the Buckeyes next season, which creates the challenge for Ohio State to figure out how to replicate the success they've had here this year. So it's important to keep in mind that Georgia's got its blemishes. But we now live in a time in which all programs have blemishes, and all programs, including the ones I just mentioned that are theoretically ranked ahead of UGA right now, they've got major offseason questions to answer as well. That whatever frustration you feel like you've seen with Mike Bobo or Stacey Searles or this player or that issue, whatever else, it doesn't make Georgia unique. It makes Georgia just like the other teams it's competing alongside. Don't be too quick to assume that Georgia, that's been a major part of the national scene now for a number of years, including 2 national championships, is all of a sudden now destined to take a step back just because this season ended in disappointment. Be very careful of that assumption, because Georgia could confound that expectation here in 2025. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're glad you're here, no matter how you get to us. Video 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio app and Sports Radio 960 The Rev, podcast wherever you find them. We're just glad you're a part of our program today. So thankful to our friends at ServPro who make it all possible for you there as well. Big mess to clean up. Some folks think Georgia's got one of those when it comes to its offense right now. They wonder if Mike Bobo is the guy to get the job done. Well, we'll let the future dictate that one way or another. We do know this, though. If you've got your own mess to clean up, whether it be fire damage, water intrusion, the home you live in, the property that you depend on for your business or passive income, whatever else, if you've seen a big mess appear there, I know you want it put back together like it never even happened. That's what our friends at ServPro are all about. They are restoration specialists. They specialize in restoring your property to its previous condition. They make it look like the mess, the damage never even happened. That is what ServPro is all about. So you can find them online, servpro.com. That's S-E-R-V, servpro.com, and have them come out today. Let their restoration specialists kind of do their magic for you. Every ServPro franchise independently owned and operated. So when you do business with ServPro, you are doing business with a company that's got a vested interest and a satisfactory outcome for you, because that's what their livelihood depends on. So find them online one more time, servpro.com, S-E-R-V. Fire damage, water intrusion, some sort of huge mess that needs to be cleaned up. Our friends at ServPro got you on that. Servpro.com, S-E-R-V, for more on that. All right, a little bit of a reversal in order. We're going to get Connor Riley before we're done today. Connor was also in Mercedes-Benz Stadium last night. We'll ask him what his key takeaways are from a Georgia perspective after last night's national championship game. We'll also do some of that coming up with Jake Fromm here in just a moment, just a couple of minutes from right now. But before we do that, let me go around the doghouse here for a moment. And listen, I totally get it. Y'all, when I come on the air and I say, boy, I'm in a good mood, I'm optimistic, I'm feeling pretty good about Georgia for 2025, respect Ohio State, they earned that national championship this year, I'm not afraid of them moving into next year. I do get that some of y'all are just not buying it. I do get that. I see the comments. In fact, I have some of them open here right now. I see that. I hear that. And while I find some of the really intense negativity a little bit annoying, at the same time, and I've promised you that I'm going to try to give platform to the people who have a slightly different perspective than me, because when there's such a large number of Georgia fans saying any one thing, it's at least worth giving some credence to it. And so we're trying to do that. We are, if you'll pardon the phrase, we're sort of retweeting it without necessarily endorsing it, if that makes sense, because I do think the voice is loud enough that that maybe it ought to be considered. However, let me give you something else to consider here for a moment. The one thing I try to do really well, and this comes across as modest, but you got to have some sort of value proposition in life, something that you do that perhaps others don't. The one thing I do feel like I'm pretty good at sometimes is I have the ability to recognize what might be true in the future that doesn't seem true today. That is the basic crux of all of our conversation. What might be true in the future that doesn't seem true today. And in college football this year, we have the perfect example of that. When we came on the show a few weeks ago, and we said this plainly and clearly, that we thought that Ohio State would not win, but play for the national championship. We were hoping that Georgia would win it, but we thought that Georgia would play Ohio State for that national championship. A lot of folks laughed in our face because the last thing we had seen was Ohio State get humbled and, frankly, embarrassed at the hands of their hated rival, Michigan. But once again, in that moment, the actual truth didn't seem true at the time. That there was a deeper truth that was kind of obscured by the most recent thing we all observed. And y'all, when you're constantly hanging on to the last thing you just saw and sort of expecting the future to look more like the present, you're going to be wrong in every way all the time. That's just sort of how it goes. That was true for Ohio State this year. That might be true for Georgia next year. So at the risk of putting too fine a point on this, let me show you one more thing here just for a moment. This is from Brett McMurphy, the longtime sports writer who now works the Action Network. Yesterday, he posted odds to win next year's national championship. Now, we could sit here and talk from beginning of the show to end about offensive line issues and Mike Bobo and, transition to a new quarterback and wide receiver drops and this and that. We could talk about all of those problems. But according to Brett McMurphy, citing the odds listed at Circus Sports, one of the big sports books out in Nevada, Georgia's got the second best odds to win next year's national championship. Second best behind only Ohio State. This year's champ, Ohio State's 5-1. Georgia's right behind them at 6-1. Ahead of Oregon and Texas and Penn State and Alabama and Notre Dame and everybody else. Georgia got the second best odds to win the national championship. So just keep that in proper context. It doesn't guarantee anything because a lot of times teams that have high odds don't end up impressing on the field. But it is an addendum to, I am worried about Georgia, and there'll be a lot of reasons for us to say we're worried about certain things related to Georgia. And yet, even in the midst of those concerns, Georgia as a program is still on more firm footing than almost any other team in America, save for perhaps this year's national champion. Just maybe some context to keep in mind with all of this. As Georgia works on fixing some stuff, it does so from a position of strength compared to almost everybody else in the rest of college football. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Now, before we're done, more from Atlanta last night. Connor Riley here for that. But for now, always a pleasure to have him as part of our show. The former Georgia quarterback, so insightful on so many things, especially when it comes to stuff like this. Let's talk to Jake Fromm and do a Kroger Fresh Take with him here today on DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me say hello to Jake Fromm. Always a pleasure to have him as a part of the program. And Jake, there's obviously a lot I want to talk to you about our sort of normal topic, but I also want to give a shout out here to the Detroit Lions. Certainly a remarkable season here this year, obviously coming up short in the NFL playoffs. We saw such tremendous emotion from Dan Campbell, who I think is such an interesting coach, such a sort of powerful response from him after the loss. What's it like to be around, the folks you're in the organization with? I know it's not fun to see a season come to an end prematurely. Obviously, a lot of work goes into a year like that, and the folks in Detroit were obviously so behind the team. I'm sure some hard times over the last couple of days.
Hey, Brandon, what's up? Always a pleasure to join you here on the show. Yeah, this week's been tough. Definitely ended a little bit sooner than we were expecting and hoping. But man, that's just the NFL, man. Kirby says it all the time. It's not the best team that wins. It's the team that plays the best that wins. We just didn't have our A game, and man, it sucks. It really does. Because we had such high hopes and aspirations for the season, but man, we'll get back to work and try to run it back next year.
No doubt about that. I expect nothing less from the Lions than that. Before we turn the page, how good is Jaden Daniels, by the way?
Really, really good football player, man, especially for a rookie. His poise in the game was just phenomenal. Man, he was extending plays with his legs, made some great accurate throws with his arm, and he handled the pressure very well and made some great checks and great adjustments. So, man, kudos to them. They really played a lights-out game, and it's going to be fun to watch their matchup next week.
So I was saying to our audience before you joined us that when I'm watching last night's game, I'm a Georgia guy. I don't make any bones about that. I'm watching games like this kind of through the lens of somebody who just cares more about Georgia than the two teams that I'm watching. That's just the way that goes. And I said to our audience a moment ago, I actually feel pretty optimistic. I didn't see anything last night or haven't seen anything this season that makes me feel like Georgia's doomed to further regression and sort of guaranteed to not be back in the major national championship conversation next year. I can't guarantee they will be, but I haven't seen anything that suggests that there's a huge chasm in between Georgia and Ohio State. And for, some additional detail on that, I remember back when LSU's winning in 2019 or when those Clemson teams were winning it or the Alabama teams from that same era, some of those teams at times looked really good to me. And you sort of felt like, boy, and you would have obviously had first-person perspective on this, that Georgia kind of needed some more stuff to be as good as kind of like Clemson, Bama, LSU might have been in that particular time frame. But watching Ohio State last night, while I have no problem saying that's the best team in America this year, I didn't see anything that made me say, man, Georgia's in some real trouble going forward. I just didn't see that, Jake. How close do you think Georgia could be to sort of being back in this again next year?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think they're definitely going to be right there in the mix. I think Gunnar gives them a phenomenal chance to be there in the mix because you watch both quarterbacks last night use their arm and then obviously use their legs. A lot of design runs. It's just kind of the nature of the way the game is evolving. But man, one thing that jumped out to me watching last night's game, obviously Ohio State has all the skill players, the receivers in the world, but their offensive line play last night was phenomenal. Man, they were running the ball at will, and Will Howard had a ton of time to sit back there and operate and extend plays when needed. So I think it starts in the trenches for this Georgia football team, getting back to just this big physicality that we're used to seeing from the offensive line and from the defensive line. And then obviously you're going to have to go spend the money for some top name skill positions. So just depends on how deep they want to go into their piggy bank. But I think they're right there in the mix right now for sure.
So I think you bring up a couple of really interesting points. First of all, when it comes to the offensive line, very impressive performance. And they also lost Seth McLaughlin during the season. That's their center who had come in from Alabama. Big tackle. They lost him there too. So what you're seeing from Ohio State in a game like this is an offensive line that was sort of put together after a couple of significant injuries. And that's why I'm going to talk more about this as the show goes on, that some people kind of want to dismiss this as, oh, well, Ohio State just sort of bought a championship. They want to kind of make them to be like the Los Angeles Dodgers or something like that,
right.
Just a team that just sort of spins whatever. But the actual truth about Ohio State, I think, is a little bit more interesting than that and a lot more complicated than just, well, they spent the most money, so therefore they won the most games. I do think you saw a team that kind of came together and figured out how to handle some adversity during the season. That I actually don't know that the real story for Ohio State was all that much different than like the Georgia teams that we all loved in 2021 and 2022 that were full of great talent, but also seemed to have some special character within all of that. I mean, listen, I can't stand Ohio State. I hate to say this, but there does appear to be some pretty interesting characters and some really strong character within that Ohio State locker room, that kind of goes beyond just the sheer amount of money they spent on the NIL.
Yeah, there's definitely correlation with spending money and winning games. I just don't think it's 100% causation like you were saying. I mean, this is a good football team. Let's give them their credit. Let's give them their flowers. They could have thrown in the towel after they lost to Michigan, and they just didn't do that, man. They kept fighting. They had a number of top 5 and top 10 wins this fall season. This team was tested. They were resilient. And like you said, just even losing a couple players and a couple pieces, man, they were still able to just fight and claw their way back and really in a dominant performance to win a national championship. And, man, just huge congrats to them because they deserve it.
So when you look at a guy like Will Howard, who quarterback for the Buckeyes, of course, at different times this season, I don't know that I was wowed by him necessarily. And to take it back to NIL for a moment, we're sort of led to believe that he's probably about a $1 million quarterback or something like that, which is no small amount of money, but that's not as much as other quarterbacks, including the one that played for Georgia, by the way. That's not the same level of financial commitment that other quarterbacks are probably getting here. And yet in the postseason, man, he came alive. I mean, last night he set a record for most completions to begin a game or something along those lines. So as a quarterback yourself, Jake, what's going on there when we see something like that happen? Is someone like me undervaluing him during the year and he's actually better than I'm giving him credit for? Or is this an example of someone who maybe wasn't, the best quarterback in America at times this year, finding a way to be the best when he really needed to be?
Yeah, I mean, this is a combination of just what it kind of looks like to put a team together and for players to enhance the person operating next to them. So a lot that we saw from Georgia 2021 and 2022, a lot of great pieces. But, man, when you put those pieces together, they just play at a phenomenal level. And, man, congrats to Will Howard last night, just having one of his best games ever in the biggest game of his career. I think the first half 14 of 15, and even the incompletion was really a very, very good, well thrown ball. So I think all these pieces, they're a good football team. Yes, they're good players, but together they really made up a really good team and helped this quarterback operate at a really high level.
It's Jake Fromm here as part of a Kroger Fresh Take on DawgNation Daily. And by the way, speaking of Kroger, if you want to get the best that Kroger has to offer, the membership opportunity they have called Kroger Boost is a great way for you to enjoy that. Free grocery delivery, free grocery pickup, that's convenience. But also, how about more money back in your pocket? You're driving around all over the place. It feels like I am these days. I feel like I'm on the road all the time. Jake, of course, making the long drive back to Georgia here right now. Well, how about saving and earning twice the fuel points on the stuff that you're already buying there at your local Kroger? You can find out more online, Kroger.com/boost for more on that. It's Kroger.com/boost for more on that today. Jake, in the time we have left, I want to take it back to Georgia here for a moment. I think one of the things you mentioned a moment ago was, okay, so the one big difference you obviously see between Georgia and Ohio State, this is not meant to disrespect anybody on the Georgia roster, but there's clearly not a Jeremiah Smith on Georgia's roster right now. Now, when you had Brock Bowers, you had a player maybe of that caliber, and certainly a guy like Ladd McConkey's close. But even like Emeka Buka and the two running backs, the one obviously that came from Ole Miss and Quinshon Judkins and Henderson too, there is a level of skill position talent that we would say that right now we're not quite so sure that Georgia has. Hopeful to see some of that emerge, but you certainly don't see that obviously being present at Georgia here right now. So moving forward, is it as simple as saying you better be able to buy talent like that if you want to keep up with the Buckeyes? Is it that simple moving forward?
It sounds that simple. It really does. I mean, for me, I'm just kind of putting my head coaching hat on, and I would do my best to recruit the best offensive line talent that I possibly could, and I would go into the portal and find veteran skill positions and really kind of pay them whatever they wanted, because you get a guy who understands ball, who's been around it, you know what you're getting and you know what you're buying, and this really just becomes a lot like NFL free agency, and you really have to put the pieces together, and it's going to be fun to kind of see what they do in that room. But yes, I do think in some aspect you do have to go and buy these skill positions to find your playmakers.
We will see, obviously, how that plays out for Georgia in time to come. Jake, you're good to join us on what is a busy day for you coming back. Please be safe and careful as you travel on those roads. And obviously, we will look forward to talking to you in the future, and obviously plenty more happy times to come for you and your Detroit Lions teammates. So thanks for your time here today, and glad to have you as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take.
That's right, Brandon. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, Jake's a good guy, man. If you're watching a video, you saw he had all the clothes in the back, literally driving home, kind of, that sort of, you see this in the NFL. They have, for whatever reason, this is a thing in the NFL in a way that it's not in college. They have like the locker room clean out day. The NFL teams sort of have that a lot, and obviously Detroit's had to do that, and now they're all going back home. So Jake on his way back here, but obviously kind to join us and share thoughts after a national championship game, and just really, really glad to have him as a part of the program today. We're not done with great guests. It's Connor Riley here coming up in a couple of minutes. A lot of fun stuff coming up with him. Prior to that, let us go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'm all tangled up in wires here. I'm also what an absolute mess this is. I'm also getting ready for a great DawgNation cruise coming up. There you go. Now I can hear again. I'm also getting ready for a great DawgNation cruise coming up in April. And when we get ready for that, I will no longer have to be wearing like 15 different layers today, freezing cold, all of that. We'll be able to just enjoy the sunshine of the Caribbean. There's nothing I love more than that. Can't wait to be doing that in April. Can't wait to have you with us as we do. Jessica Slater's a wonderful travel agent. She can get you ready for, I believe there's still space for you, but you got to probably act now because that ship is going to sail out, and our availability on our DawgNation cruise, kind of our sort of protected staterooms. I'm sure we're near the end there on that too, but may still have a little bit of time to get involved. Call Jessica today, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll get you ready for that. And it's not just Utopia the Seas in April. Don't forget, there's big news coming from Royal Caribbean this summer, the debut of Star of the Seas. It's the newest in the Icon class of ships. It's going to be sailing out of Port Canaveral. So excited to have that brand new ship, kind of what I think of as my home port. Cannot wait for all of that. It's going to be amazing. So as we go cruise around the SEC, I want to focus on the national championship game here just for a minute. And I'm going to start with this. And this is not an attempt to be snarky or anything like that. I'm being as honest as I'm capable of being. So I was thinking about Ohio State winning the national championship last night, and they deserve all the credit in the world for that. Really good team, very impressive postseason run. They finished the year by beating a lot of ranked teams here this year. But let me tell you what I'm really glad about. I'm really glad that both of Georgia's national championships here during the Kirby Smart era don't come with the opportunity for someone else to have bragging rights over us. You know, for instance, when Georgia won the national championship in 2021, Georgia lost to Alabama in the SEC championship, but Georgia also avenged that loss during the season. So they beat us in Atlanta. We got them back in Indianapolis, and that's kind of a nice, clean conclusion to the season. No chance for Alabama to sort of say whatever because Georgia got the measure of revenge there in Indianapolis. In 2022, nobody beat Georgia. There's nothing to worry about there. So, like right now, Ohio State is on top of the college football world. And they don't want to hear from these Michigan people. They don't want any of that. But you also know, because many of you kind of function the same way online and then within your sort of college football, friends out there, you know how it's going to go. You let a little bit of this sort of confetti stop falling and a little bit of the celebration die down, and these Michigan people are going to come back out of the woodworks. They're going to say, well, it's nice you got that national championship, but just keep in mind, you can't beat us. You may could beat Notre Dame, but you can't beat us. And that's just the nature of rivalries. And it is weird that Ohio State does, to a degree, have to listen to that. Now, listen, I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm not trying to, discount their championship or anything like that. I'm just saying this is how college football fan conversation operates, is that if you leave the door open for someone to diminish your accomplishment, they are going to do it. And these Michigan fans are going to try to diminish the Ohio State championship, and to some degree they might succeed because, honestly, we've seen plenty of message board chatter from Ohio State fans right up until they won the national championship, where they themselves were talking about how hollow it felt knowing they did not beat Michigan. They themselves said that. They're almost going to be kind of condemned on the basis of their own words here. So that rivalry probably does get pretty interesting. And I'm really thankful that Georgia didn't have anything like that to kind of tarnish either of its two national championships, whether Ohio State's going to have to deal with some of that. I also thought this was interesting. And once again, I don't have a lot of bad stuff to say about last night's game, either the two teams that are involved. I don't have any kind of beef, with that at all. But could not help but notice that it seems like that a team like Notre Dame in a spot like this was graded on a curve. Do you know what that phrase means? Perhaps in college you benefited from being graded on a curve every now and then, getting a better grade than perhaps you deserved. Could not help but notice that it seemed like Notre Dame was being graded on a curve in the way that other teams oftentimes would not be in a national championship game. That there was a lot of, boy, you got to take your hat off to this Irish team. They are fighting hard. It's almost like it's understood that they are not as talented, even though that's a good football team. They are not as talented as the team that they are playing. And so, therefore, the fact that they went out there and gave it a valiant effort, that is enough, man. They deserve credit for that. I felt like we saw more talk about the national championship game loser than we're used to seeing. And, think back to the Sugar Bowl, for instance. And I don't want to make a big thing about this, but just consider this. Did you hear any, pundit, talking head on TV, commentariat? Did you hear anybody saying anything along the lines of, man, Georgia's out there playing without its starting quarterback. They ought to be given all the credit in the world for how valiantly they fought right to the end. Did you hear anybody say that? Of course you didn't. And even though Notre Dame was the favorite in the game, it's not like Georgia was some sort of heavy favorite in this spot with Gunnar Stockton starting. And legitimately, it is hard to play without your backup, without your starting quarterback, putting your backup into starting duty there. But it seems like you don't quite get the little pat on the back. And it's not just Georgia, by the way. When Alabama lost to Georgia in 2021, they're not like crediting Alabama. Boy, they played so hard right to the end. It sort of feels like that's the kind of thing that's sort of reserved for teams like Notre Dame for whatever reason. I'll let you judge that for yourself. Something else I wanted to mention, Fromm, and I don't have any kind of like video or audio to play for you on this, but many of you know what this is. My opinion on this may surprise you a little bit. Did y'all see Kirk Herbstreit last night? So I have not seen it. I have read it. Allegedly, Herbstreit was crying on TV again. And in this case, crying because of his alma mater and I guess some sort of close bond he feels with Ryan Day and the way in which Ohio State overcame, all kinds of stuff to win the national championship and essentially kind of showed himself to be an Ohio State grad on TV last night, something that a lot of times it would sort of seem like Herbstreit sort of works hard to make people forget that he does have a hometown and a former program. He is an alumnus of Ohio State. Last night seemed to be okay showing in public that side of himself. And that really gets on a lot of people's nerves. Can I just say this, though? I actually think we need more of that in college football, not less. I don't think there's anything wrong with Kirk Herbstreit having a favorite team, having an alma mater. I think one of his sons may even be – it seems like he's got a lot of sons, but one of his sons may be at Ohio State. I know he's been at Clemson, places like – they've got people at Clemson, places like that. But there's nothing wrong with being from somewhere and having affection from the place that you're from. These are not robots that we put on TV. In fact, I think all of those guys would do better to sort of demonstrate that aspect of their personality. And anytime the broadcaster begins his career, there's always that attempt to like show how neutral and objective you can be. That's always so boring. Gosh, that's so boring. And frankly, the kinds of like consultants and managers and agents that suggest that you do that are usually wrong, to be honest. So Herbstreit crying last night because of his alma mater won the national championship. I don't love the crying part, to be frank, but being happy for Ohio State because you went to Ohio State, I got no problem with that whatsoever. And I actually think college football on TV would be a little bit more interesting if more people would just sort of own up to who they are, who they like, and who they don't like. Because honestly, when you really listen to what's going on, emotionless neutrality is something that doesn't seem to exist in large measure anyway. So why not just be open and out front about what it actually is? But we'll make that cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, before I bring on Connor Riley and have a conversation with him about what he saw in Atlanta last night, let me also give a shout-out to our friends at Academy Sports and Outdoors. It's cold today, so I don't know how much outside time I'm going to have today, but this is the time of year that folks are kind of loving getting back outside again. Baseball practice is starting up, all kinds of fun outdoor activities taking place. And when it comes to the gear you need for the things that you love doing, our friends at Academy Sports and Outdoors got you for all of that. Prices that you'll love, curbside pickup, super convenient, and it's never been easier to shop kind of online for a lot of this kind of stuff too at academy.com. Whether it's good-looking UGA apparel, nice stuff for a tailgate, camping supplies, baseball, softball, all that kind of stuff, you can get all of that with our friends at Academy Sports and Outdoors. Find them online at academy.com. Let's bring in Connor Riley now. Last night in Atlanta, Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Connor, we've had a lot of sleepless nights after national championship games that Georgia has played in. Probably not quite as much fun to have the sleepless night when it's a couple of teams you really have no emotional tie to. What was it like being in the building last night?
Yeah, I mean, just as a college football fan, it's really cool to get to cover national championship games and be a part of it. And midway through the third quarter, when Ohio State is just rolling Notre Dame and we're pitching stories, and I'm going to do a story on Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs because, even though this Ohio State team is losing so much, their entire defensive line, 4 to 5 starters in the secondary, starting quarterback, potentially both their top running backs, they're still going to be really good because they have arguably the 2 best players in college football. And then Jeremiah Smith goes out there and makes, the play that he makes in that game. It was really cool to get to see that. The Ohio State locker room from a championship standpoint, very, very different from the Georgia locker room.
Is that right?
I I don't know if there are cigar bars that have as much cigar smoke in them as the Ohio State locker room did last night. But to the victor go the spoils. And, for an Ohio State program that went through a lot this season, some of it fair, some of it not, to get to see and to speak to some of those guys after having a very difficult season, given the expectations that they had, it was cool to see that. Luke Montgomery, whose brother Ryan is coming here to play quarterback at the University of Georgia, had a nice moment with him after the game last night and just talking with him about everything that this Ohio State team went through. So, Ohio State in some ways are the villains, but, they deserve, they were the best, in my opinion, they were the best team in college football this year. Didn't always play like it, but in the playoff that they made, they did when it counted.
Yeah, listen, I make no bones about this. I don't like Ohio State nor Notre Dame. I look to take pot shots at either of them any chance that I can get, but I was there last night. Thought the vibe in the stadium was really pretty good. Felt like a big game. Thought the game was pretty entertaining. Notre Dame, to its credit, did enough to sort of keep your interest for the full 60 minutes. And Ohio State won. And I said this before you joined us, Connor, that I don't know that I would have been willing to give full credit to Michigan a year ago for truly being better than Georgia and being, undeniably the best team in America. But for Ohio State this year, I've got no problem doing that. This was the best team in America. Maybe Georgia could have played better and, been in the game, but I don't think I don't think that Georgia was as good as Ohio State this year. I do believe that Ohio State was the best team in America.
And that was very apparent to me, I think, in the second quarter when you're watching Ohio State have the success that they had running the football, over 220 rushing yards on the night for that team. Obviously, Quinshon Judkins had a massive game for the Buckeyes, and Will Howard's legs, I thought, were really, really big for that offense in terms of just keeping drives going and scoring early for them. And Georgia's run game looked nothing like that, not just against Notre Dame, which gave them fits, but at really any point of the season. And so Ohio State last night looked like a national title team. I thought as well Notre Dame looked at times like a national title team during stretches of that game last night. They just weren't able to make enough plays when they needed to there. And for Georgia, I think you can look at it, still a really good team, a team that I think as time goes by deserves to be celebrated for winning the SEC in the manner in which they did, especially with the schedule that they had to play. But I think it's also very fair to say that, especially when you compare them to the 2021 and 2022 teams, and even the 2023 teams, this was not the same level of championship team that Georgia has fielded in the past. And I think, it got glossed over a little bit when the point was made because it was right after that Tennessee game and emotions were high and everyone was feeling good about themselves again. Kirby Smart flat out said this has not been the most talented team that he has had at the University of Georgia. And for so much of those first two titles, and even this Notre Dame title in the last era of college football that we were in, the sort of super team era, talent matters more than anything else. Ohio State was more talented than Notre Dame was. I thought maybe Notre Dame was a better coach team. I think Notre Dame, for my money, was the best coach team in college football this season. But talent, as it did with Jeremiah Smith last night, it just wins out more often than not in college football. And Georgia's got to find a way in a more difficult environment now moving forward because of NIL, because of the transfer portal, to get more talented.
So all that said, I have said plenty of times today, I'm still pretty optimistic about Georgia because while you saw Ohio State last night, over the course of the last 4 games, you've seen Ohio State at its best. But to truly, I think, have the proper evaluation of the season, you have to judge them at their best and at their worst. And like Georgia fans right now are fixated on a really bad moment to conclude the season for Georgia against Notre Dame, but Ohio State fans were just as fixated on a really bad moment for the Buckeyes to conclude the regular season against Michigan. They were 20-point favorites. They're at home against their hated rival, and they played embarrassingly and lost, in that game. So while Ohio State's better than Georgia and Ohio State has some things right now that Georgia doesn't have, I'm not going to concede that the gap is somehow this chasm that cannot be crossed. And when you look at the other teams that have the potential of being ranked ahead of Georgia begin next season, Texas, a team that Georgia beat twice, Notre Dame, a team that did beat Georgia, but I don't think anybody watched that game wondered, gosh, how does Georgia get over the Notre Dame hump? I don't think anybody's saying, how does that happen? Penn State kind of much the same way. And listen, maybe next year Penn State becomes the next Big Ten team to win it all. But that's not what anybody was saying prior to these playoffs beginning. So Georgia's got its issues. Georgia needs to have some players that look a little bit more like the best players that Ohio State has. I am more than happy to say all of that. But unlike when, like, say, LSU was winning it in 2019, or when Clemson was winning it in 2018, or when Bama was winning it in 2015, like, I don't see a national champion this year that looks like it lives in a completely different zip code than UGA. I just don't.
No, and that's sort of the point I made in one of the stories I wrote last night. The era of college football that we were just in, this sort of super team era where 4 or 5 teams just have an overwhelming amount of talent, and it seems like it all comes together for one team each year. 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama, though that was a COVID year, so whoever really knows about that. Right. 21 Georgia, 22 Georgia, even 23 Michigan, and now 24 Ohio State. That sort of 6-year run, all of those teams, I think you can make an argument, with maybe the exception of that Michigan team, as an all-time great team. And so moving forward, and this is sort of the other part of that story, we're going from an era where 85-man scholarships matter the most and having an 85-man depth matter a lot to, I think, to use the NFL model of 53 guys, it's a shrinking of the roster. And so having those super elite guys moving forward, I think is going to be more important than ever. Yeah. Georgia's still got plenty of elite guys. There are guys you would absolutely love to have on those teams. Notre Dame, I bet, would love to come and pick some of the players off of Georgia's roster. And Georgia, look, there is still a championship DNA in this team and guys on this program. One of the things I hope to dive into moving forward, that sort of 2023 recruiting class has not lived up to the billing. They've already had, I think, 10 guys from that recruiting class transfer out. And on paper, it doesn't necessarily look great. But it's a program moving forward. You still feel really good about what you have. They've got to find ways to, I think, churn out more individual star players. I think Nate Frazier has to become a nationally known name. I think KJ Bolden has to make a jump forward as a player. They need some of the wide receivers they've obviously brought in to take steps forward. And then the last thing that I want to touch on here, Jack Sawyer was someone I spent a little bit of time around this weekend, both at the media day and then watching him for the game, and just the presence that he had. It resembled what Jordan Davis was for that 21 Georgia team, what Nolan Smith was for that 22 Georgia team. It seems like every sort of championship team has someone like that, at least in this most recent era.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm sorry. Yeah, finish your point.
Yeah, no, because we're on the same page on this. As we sit here today, I don't know who that player is for Georgia in 2025. That person could emerge. There are candidates there that I think it could be. But Georgia, as we sit here, doesn't have an obvious Jack Sawyer type. And it just seems like with what we've seen in college football, having that type of player really matters. Because obviously he's an incredibly gifted player, but someone who has been through the ups and downs and understands, I think, what this program is about. Who is that guy going to be for Georgia in 2025?
Okay, I'm really glad you're bringing this up because I have been thinking about this a lot. And I've gone on a little bit of a journey over the course of the last few weeks. If people want to go back and watch the post-game show after Notre Dame beat Georgia, I'm on there, and I still stand by this, but I'm on there saying, man, you've got to have the superstar players. You've got to have the superstar players. You've got to have superstar players. And it certainly looks like that's what Ohio State has. Jeremiah Smith is, Caleb Downs is. The two running backs, probably are. Honestly, Will Howard may be. I mean, it certainly looks like they have superstar players. But, Connor, I got to tell you, in sort of looking at Ohio State a little bit more deeply because they were one of only 2 teams still left, man, there's a lot about this Ohio State team that reminds you of those really good Georgia teams. And listen, there's nothing I'd love more than to diminish their accomplishment by saying, man, best team money could buy, $20 million roster, mercenary team. I would love to diminish their accomplishment by saying this is nothing more than a transactional football team. But that is not true. Sawyer seems like a legitimately good dude. And a bunch of guys, just kind of watching some of the post-game stuff last night. And I know that when you win, everything sort of seems good and everybody sort of seems like the highest character and integrity. Winners get to write the history and they'll always kind of write it in a very favorable way. I do get that. But honestly, a lot of that NIL money that Ohio State spent was spent keeping players that had been in Columbus. And there does seem to be, I thought that Scott Van Pelt and whoever on TV were doing a good job talking about this last night. There does seem to be a little bit of a cohesiveness and a connection about Ohio State, even though they've got Jeremiah Smith, who may make $3 million next year, and Caleb Downs, who made heaven knows what this year. Even though they've got those kind of guys, there was that connection, at least the way they tell it, that does kind of remind you of what really defined Georgia in 2021 and 2022. And so, when Georgia loses, there's a part of me that wants to be like, hey, man, it's time to go full-scale mercenary and just buy yourself some superstars and go out there and just get it done, whether it feels good or not. But then you see Ohio State, and they still do seem a little bit like some of the touchy-feely stuff that seemed to be working for Georgia back when there was a lot of shared glory on those championship teams in 2021 and 2022. So I don't know where that leaves you, but it's an interesting comparison for me.
And I think going forward, I think Georgia understands that and now has a better idea of what to look for in players that are going to want to stick around. And to your point, I think so much of that NIL money, yes, obviously Jeremiah Smith, Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins, et cetera, was keeping those players that could have gone to the draft last year. Emeka Ibuka, Sawyer, JT Tiomalo, I'm sorry for mispronouncing his name there.
Good player,
Ransom.
just can't pronounce his name, right?
JT,
player,
I'm calling him
can't
JT.
Pronounce his name. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'm calling him JT, the defensive end. They brought so many of those guys back and kept them around for another year. And I think you saw Georgia do some of that this year. You saw Oscar Delp come back, Dylan Bell come back, Christian Miller come back, Dalen Everett come back. You need those types of guys to come back, guys who would have been drafted, in my opinion, not first rounders. And that's where someone, like if Jalen Walker were coming back, and look, I know as the president of the fan club, who's surprised to bring him up. Like Jalen Walker would have been the perfect Jack Sawyer candidate, but Jack Sawyer wasn't a first-round pick a year ago, like Jalen Walker is going to be in April. And so that's the balance I think that you have to strike there. And I think an encouraging thing that I think Georgia gets this and knows what they're looking for moving forward. Of the guys they signed in their 2024 recruiting class, 0 transferred out after their first year. And I think that's something that is worth following moving forward, because the 23 recruiting class had a few guys transfer out after their first year, and then even further attrition this year. You look at guys like Damon Wilson transferring out. I think that 24 recruiting class and the way that they put it together and the way they have kept it together so far, I think is an encouraging sign for Georgia moving forward, that they're going to understand how to navigate and what to look for guys that want to come and be a part of their program. That's not to say that everyone in this class is going to stay through the end of their careers, but I think they are doing a better job moving forward of navigating this transfer portal and how to go about building a team that can win a national championship.
It's a really interesting thought. Anything final thought here from you? Obviously, I'm always sad when the season comes. I'm really weird about stuff like this. First of all, I'm very sentimental. I'm just so goofy about stuff like this. I'm always sad when the season comes to an end. And I'm also a little bit sad when Georgia's not in like the biggest game. Like, obviously, if you're a Georgia fan, you want that to be different next year. But any kind of final thought from you now that we really are putting a true full lid on this 2024 season?
Yeah, I thought it was a great season. I think as a Georgia fan, as we get further away from it, I hope they appreciate the accomplishments and what this team went through this year. It wasn't a perfect team. They got dealt a really bad hand by the SEC, and in terms of scheduling, I'll go on the record and say that. And I know Kirby believes it in the same manner in which they do. There's some things they got to get cleaned up. It seemed like, look, they're answering some culture questions because of the arrest that happened in the offseason. They've got to make sure that they're more buttoned up in that regard moving forward. But I think that this is a program that, look, they're navigating a time of change. They're trying to figure this out. Ohio State won it this first year, winning it in that way. Ohio State won the first 14 playoff, and they didn't win a 14 playoff iteration again. And so I think that's important to keep in mind here. It's just 1 year before we make any big sweeping generalizations or changes. And for as difficult as this season was with the schedule that Georgia played, where they play 7 ranked teams that finished the season ranked in the AP top 25 poll, effectively every other game was against a team ranked in the top 20 of the AP poll. This team still won an SEC championship. They still showed tremendous grit. They went to Texas and beat them. They beat them again in the SEC championship game after everyone said it's really hard to beat a team twice, and everyone saw Carson Beck leave that game at the end of the first half there. And yes, you don't have your starting quarterback in that playoff game there, but you still show tremendous resiliency. A few plays go your way. Maybe you're playing Ohio State for a national title. I don't think Georgia was going to beat this Ohio State team that we saw at the end of the season, but going forward, I think that the way this season ended may end up being a good thing for this Georgia team in terms of resetting and knowing that, again, after you go 42-2 over a 3-year stretch, it's not always like that. That's why it's a historic stretch.
Yeah.
And that the way that this season turned out, I think taught Kirby Smart and taught this Georgia program a lot about itself. And I think that is going to pay off moving forward.
Connor, great conversation. Appreciate everything. Look, I'm really looking forward to the next few months. I think it's going to be really fun. I really do. And not every single question that Georgia fans have is going to be resolved in a positive manner. That's just the fact. Not everything is going to be great. There is going to be probably some disappointment, and some things don't quite work out the way we want it to if you are a Georgia fan. But, boy, plenty of it I think is going to work out pretty well, and it's all going to be really compelling, I think. So can't wait to talk to you about all of it. Really fun 2025 on tap here. Get some rest, and we'll look forward to chatting soon.
BAM is equally sentimental as you. This is the favorite show that I do every year, the morning after the national championship game. I'm bummed we're not in person, but hopefully this time next year we're doing this live from Miami, recapping another Georgia national championship and chronicling it all between now and then.
This is self-serving, but did you go to the media post-game party last night? How was that?
It was a good time. I think people were very glad to get out of the cold, given how cold things were last night. For sure, yeah. Certainly a hollow celebration at the end of the season with Georgia not there. But good stuff, Connor. Appreciate that, and we will chat soon. Really, really do appreciate it. As always, it's a pleasure.
Good stuff there from Connor Riley. And one of the things that he said that kind of, brought to mind so many times for Georgia over the course of, like, say, 2020, especially like 2023, where it's like, oh, this is the most consecutive SEC games anybody's ever won. Or this is, like, there are all these, like, little things, and I'm probably getting some of these wrong, but, like, there were all these little milestones that Georgia was clicking off that was like, well, this is a record, and that's a record. And, in my mind, every time Georgia's sort of clicking this off, Georgia had a way of making all of that seem really easy. But when you realize they were doing things that no one else had ever done, what you were forced to confront is, oh, well, eventually some of this is going to come to an end, because if no one's done more than this prior to this, then Georgia doing much more than this now is going to probably get hard at some point in a way we can't necessarily foresee right now. And ultimately, that's what happened. And so now you sort of dust yourself off and you sort of clean yourself back up and you get right back to it. But as we said a little earlier, be very mindful of what might be true in the future that doesn't seem true right now. Georgia kind of stuck in the muck and mire of a loss to Notre Dame and the Sugar Bowl. That's sort of when history began for many people, that the only thing that matters is how bad Georgia looked in that game. But it's the sheer preponderance of evidence of things that happened before that and the things that happened around that. All of that goes together to help Georgia's story, tell Georgia's story in the future. And as I said before, we remain quite optimistic about all of that. I'd also tell you before we get ready to say goodbye to you today that our friends at Daytona Beach got some great things going on here right now. 23 miles of shoreline right there in the Atlantic coast of Florida. I don't quite think the snow got that far south today, I don't think. I know it's been snowing in places that don't typically get snow. I don't think it got quite as far south as the gorgeous A1A that kind of goes right through the heart of Daytona. But I tell you what, if you want to escape the cold weather and snow and all that kind of stuff, being at Daytona Beach is a great way to do that. I grew up going to Daytona. I'd love to be there right now. It'd be a lot of fun. And the cool thing is you can get there pretty easy. They've got an international airport. You can fly right to there directly from Atlanta. That's always really nice and cool and convenient. So if you want to enjoy great restaurants, a lot of hotel options, also fun outdoor activities like surfing capital of the Atlantic, all kinds of cool golf. You like fishing and all the parasailing or kayaking, all that kind of stuff. There's so many different ways to enjoy great stuff there in Daytona Beach. So check out DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals for more on that. DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. And by the way, don't forget, we're getting pretty close to the Daytona 500 too. So kind of nice to have that back in our lives here again very soon as well. So DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals for more on that today. So very funny golden shoe here today. Our buddy Mad Dog sends it in. This is kind of a throwback to a joke we've had going on here for a while. I'll show you this on the screen here. Mad Dog writes in, this is what the national championship trophy looks like after Ryan Day kisses it. It gives you the hashtag just for men. What you see is the beard dye just sort of staining the championship trophy. Our friends at Dr. Pepper will not be happy about that. By the way, shout out to our good folks at Dr. Pepper who were once again kind host to me last night. But yeah, so you see the beard dye staining the national championship trophy. And by the way, have y'all noticed this? That the beard dye conspiracy is everywhere now. All kinds of media outlets are talking about this, but we were talking about this 2 years ago. I feel like I broke this story nationally, that Ryan Day likely not a natural beard color because no one's beard's actually that black. I feel like I broke that story. Must credit DawgNation Daily now that everybody's talking about that. But very funny stuff from Mike the Mad Dog. We'll give him a golden shoe. And you know what? We're in a giving mood today. We'll give Ryan Day a golden shoe, too, so he can put that alongside his national championship trophy. But just don't get any greasy beard dye on our golden shoe, we would ask. Lousy, stinking Gators, we got no gifts for them. But we do offer a reminder. It's been 1,536 days since the lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Hope you have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. Garrison Tucker says, let's be honest, Chip Kelly won this national title, not Ryan Day. So I'll be the first to tell you. I don't think I'm smart enough to know like how much of an impact Chip Kelly made. I don't think I'm smart enough to know that. I won't pretend to be. Being in the stadium last night, obviously you saw a lot of really successful plays. I would ask how much of that was because, boy, Chip Kelly is just that sharp of an offensive mind. Because keep in mind, he's been calling plays now for his other teams for quite some time. That has certainly had certainly mixed results. Let's just say it that way. But, boy, last night everything they were calling was working. Is that working because Chip Kelly's so smart? Is that working because Ohio State just had better players? And like the one story was when Howard gets off to that fast start, he's just completing everything. You know, I think that there, was some issue of, well, gosh, how long can this Buckeye secondary, this Notre Dame secondary kind of hold up with this? Obviously there had been some concern. They were sort of overmatched coming into that, and how would they try to sort of coach around what is clearly an advantage for the Ohio State wide receivers against the secondary for Notre Dame. And in the early stages of this game, that was really pronounced. It was really obviously recognizable. Everybody could see it. But once again, is that Chip Kelly doing that, or is that just better players overwhelming their opponents? I won't pretend to be smart enough to necessarily diagnose one from the other, but boy, I certainly saw a lot of guys open last night for Ohio State. Ken Holcomb says, I hope the high-dollar donors are lining up to donate big money to the Classic City Collective right now. Ohio State just proved that you have to buy championships. We were talking about that a moment ago. I can't, as much as I'd love to, score points with all of you, I can't just dismiss the Ohio State championship as buying a title in the same way that, say, you might accuse the Dodgers of that or someone like that. I mean, a good bit of the Ohio State money was spent keeping guys who had been on the roster. So I also believe that Georgia, from a financial standpoint, is probably close in keeping, anyway, with what Ohio State is probably spending. I think that Georgia's within the ballpark of that. But I think that Kent's overall point is probably still accurate, which is being aggressive with all of this and figuring out a creative way to be able to do that is just a big part of the college football conversation right now. And I don't think that anybody needs to necessarily shy away from that. I think that's true. Devil Dog says Ohio State might be where big NIL meets good coaching, and perhaps that's the case because it does seem like they had the combination of the really uber-talented superstar-type players and a bunch of guys that seem to really enjoy playing with each other. There was a good vibe around that team. And I don't take joy in saying that, but it seems like it's probably true. Let's see what else. Let me go over to YouTube for a moment. MG on the subject of Dylan Bell. Would not surprise me to see Dylan Bell used in a little bit of a different manner this upcoming season than he was this past year. Been some chatter about that. You could see a little bit of a different role for him, perhaps maybe a little bit more like some of the stuff you saw from him in 2023. They may need it, but also it just may be good for him in particular. JT Thompson says, from a business perspective, now is the time to spend aggressively. So I kind of agree with that. And I've actually said this before, JT, that there's something to me that's interesting in college football where you would never want your rival to be good, but your rival being good oftentimes makes you better. You know, when we first started doing some of the Gatorade stuff many, many years ago, that was sort of the genesis behind that, because at the time Florida was pretty good. So, hey, use their success as a motivating factor for you to be even better. And you see this. Like, you're going to see Ohio State win a championship the year after its hated rival Michigan won a championship. Well, that's a little bit like, I want to go back to, you know, Auburn won the national title Alabama won the national title in 2009. Auburn won it in 2010. Bama came back and won it again in 2011 and 2012. Auburn played for it in 2013. There is something to be said for when your rival is really, really good, it kind of forces you to be better than you otherwise might be. And so, you know, I do think if you're a Georgia fan, you're disappointed, or if you're certainly a Georgia fan of means and you're tired of seeing these Big Ten teams, you know, kind of celebrate on your turf here in Atlanta. We call Atlanta our town. If you're tired of that, boy, it'd be a great time to use that as motivation to kind of pass the offering plate and raise more money and see if you know, you can make the big spin that gives you a chance to kind of resemble everything that Ohio State had going for it in a game like last night. Sometimes disappointment can be a powerful motivator. So I don't disagree with that. BA's Cardigan says, we need contracts. Do these kids have contracts? What's funny about that, Cardigan, is that, you know, the issue we talked about yesterday, is it Xavier Lucas? That's the defensive back from Wisconsin. He had a contract, and his lawyer says we can just break this contract. So even that doesn't seem to kind of hold up the way that you'd like for it to be able to, signing a contract on the basis of the new revenue sharing that's coming in. And they're going to challenge that. I mean, look, there are some people out there, and they're almost all lawyers, and they almost all stand to enrich themselves because of this. They want to completely strip everything in college athletics down to the point there are no rules. I mean, like, keep in mind, we just had this like house settlement thing, and it's they're trying to, I guess, finalize all of this. Ask yourself, who is going to get the richest off the house settlement? Back pay to ex-athletes, revenue sharing to current athletes, government steps in and says, Title IX, you got to keep it fair between the men and the women. Who's going to get the richest off the house settlement? It's going to be the lawyers that negotiated all of this. They're the ones that are going to get the richest. So there's a group of lawyers out there that seem to have figured out that there is personal enrichment to be had by destroying college athletics as we know it. And if somebody powerful doesn't stand up and say, this ends now, it ends, it stops. We are choosing to protect this institution, and we are not going to let it be demolished by lawfare. We are going to protect this until somebody steps up and just makes up a reason why, makes up an interpretation of the law, if need be, just invents a new novel interpretation of existing law, whatever it takes to say this ends now. If it doesn't, eventually these lawyers will picket this until it's unrecognizable. That will happen. Gary Roach says, I always say you're only as good as your coach. I think Kirby's going to challenge his coaches and players to step up their game as a team. I don't doubt that at all, Gary. I believe that 100% is likely to take place. G. Gray says that Texas was successful because they played no one. I do believe that there's a chance that if Texas had played a schedule that looked more like the one that Georgia played, or frankly, that looked more like the one that other SEC teams played, very good chance that our feeling of Texas perhaps could have been quite different. I think there's a chance that's true. Let me check out Facebook for a moment. We'll see what's going on over here. Let us see what else. Grady Darcy says that Spurrier said all the way back in 1992 that he thought the SEC would beat each other up and cause us to be less competitive. I don't necessarily agree, but it seems legit this year. Big Ten only has 2 or 3 good teams. They don't get injured as much. Maybe that's the case, but I mean, and I get the point that you're making. And I do believe at one point in time Georgia was suffering because of the schedule that it played. But, I think that, Ohio State put a lot in making this a championship season, whether it be the money they spent or just the focus they put on it. They really went after this thing. And I don't think you can dispute that too much. George Herndon says the media has had a field day talking down about the SEC. They absolutely have, George. Hard not to notice. It is hard not to notice. And look, for somebody like me, I try to be really good about, some of you obviously can tell some of my biases by the way I'm dressed, things like that. We're pro Georgia around here, of course. We don't pretend not to be. But other sort of biases and things like that, closely held beliefs, I try to be transparent about that when I can. I try to let people know what the real story is. There are a lot of other people that would have you believe, oh man, they are just objective arbiters of the truth. Boy, some of the stuff you hear sometimes doesn't exactly sound like emotionless neutrality, does it? Can't help but notice. Matt Rukavina says, as I said earlier, it's not about buying up recruits, it's buying up players other teams have already developed. I think Ohio State pioneered that this year. I do think there's an element of truth to that. And I find myself as a fan, the thing I've said a few times is, at a certain point in time, you've raised all the money you're going to raise, whether it's $20 million or $15 million or $25 million or $30 million and beyond. At a certain point, you've got the money you've got. How you choose to use that money is really important. So to go to your point of, if you're paying freshmen and if you're winning these major recruiting battles, high 4-star this or 5-star that, they're not coming to your program without a hefty NIL payment. They're just not. This idea that, Georgia doesn't play that game. BS. Georgia's not winning these recruiting battles without paying significant dollars to get these players. That's just a fact. So you have to wonder, okay, well, how many of those incoming, and I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. Like, this is not a prescription. This is just kind of riffing based on what Matt said. So how many of those freshmen, hard-fought recruiting battles, how many of those freshmen are truly ready to play in their first year? Sometimes some of them are. Not all of them always are, though. It's still hard to play as a freshman. I think one of the things that every program is going to ask moving forward is, how much money are we paying to guys who aren't really playing very much? We're paying backups for depth. We're paying freshmen to develop. Like, how much of that are we really spending, and are we getting a strong return on our spend when we do that? Now, there's a flip side risk to that too, which is, hey, you can invest in a bunch of transfers and you can still lose 3 games. That's what Ole Miss did this year. And it's not obvious that Ole Miss is even a top 25 team next year. They may take a huge step back because they don't quite have a crop of new transfers ready to replace the old transfers. They don't quite have – that may change, but as of now, they don't quite have that. So nothing is guaranteed to work. But I do think big questions are going to be asked moving forward of how you choose to use your money and how much of that money you give to guys that are not starting, that are not playing very much. Like that essentially almost functions, to use an NFL phrase, that almost functions like dead cap, money. Just sort of dead money on your salary cap. Yeah, Steve Self says, how much money are we paying players that will leave to play next year? Yeah, I mean, if you pay a guy for a year to develop under you and then he leaves and goes somewhere else, not only are you out the money you paid that player, but you essentially paid him to learn how to one day maybe beat you. I mean, and that's not an easy conversation to have. I don't have an easy solution to that necessarily, but that to me is a big part of it here right now, which is Jalen Carter being a backup defensive lineman the way that he was in 2021. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. That the quality of your backups, the quality of your depth may just not be as good as it once was. And you just got to be okay getting the most you can out of the guys who play the most and trying to figure out a way to put most of your kind of compensation in that direction, I think. Craig Jones said, I had no use for the game last night. If there was a way for both teams to lose, that would have been my choice. The game got away from Notre Dame and wasn't worth watching. He said he was watching the inauguration instead. I mean, I thought that Notre Dame did a good job. Obviously, they came down the field, scored in the first drive, chewed up a lot of clock, and I do think that actually really helped them. If you have a chance to shorten the game against Ohio State, if you're Notre Dame, of course you'd want to. So you got the lead, but you also essentially ate up almost a full quarter of the game, which made the rest of the potential upset a little easier to pull off. Now, at one point in time, it seemed like Ohio State was going to really run away with it, but to Notre Dame's credit, they scored a touchdown. They got a couple 2 points, scored a couple touchdowns, really got a couple 2-point conversions. To their credit, they found a way to kind of stay in it. Kirk Schultz says college football has changed so much too fast. Money's muddying the waters, don't like where it's heading. So I do get that, Kirk. And it is obvious that a lot of people don't like this, that there's only a small percentage of the population that thinks that college athletics is heading somewhere good. Only a small percentage of the population. Now, all of the very rich, very well-educated folks in big cities all seem to think it's changing for the better. And so, therefore, seemingly it's not going to stop because the people with the most sort of cultural influence are all in pretty close to unanimous agreement about this. And that, for whatever reason, is the only thing that matters. But the public at large, I think a lot of people kind of agree with you. However, the one thing I will say is, even though I've got my issues with all kinds of stuff, man, college football is still pretty resilient. College athletics, I think, is still pretty resilient. And even in the face of people that would harm it, and in the face of people that might harm it on purpose, and I honestly believe there are people out there that are perhaps trying to destroy this on purpose. How else do you explain some of this? Even in the face of all of that, the sport itself is still so special that it just sort of endures. It just sort of endures. It endures in the face of sort of hapless leadership, feckless bureaucracy, malicious infiltrators, whatever there is out there. It just sort of endures. And, man, I as corny as it sounds, I'm never going to stop sort of fighting to, keep it alive because it's still just so good. It's getting worse, but it's still just so good. Philip Jordan Wells says Ohio State was the dream that the old Pony Express SMU never got to fulfill, which is very funny. All right, final comments. We're going to go. Beach Dog says, will the games be better with way more freshmen playing? Many, many more will be on the field. Yeah, so I sort of said this around the FCS playoffs, that, if football ever takes a step back from a talent perspective, I think I still like it. I do. I like the FCS playoffs. I don't obviously watch every snap, but I do like it. I mean, keep in mind, there used to be, 30 NFL teams. Now there's 32. When I was young, before I was born, there were even less than that. That there are plenty of sort of old timers in the NFL that'll tell you that league has become more and more watered down because you keep adding more teams. Quality of quarterback play goes down, things like that, because more teams. Every time you add a new team, that's 53 players that weren't in the NFL before that are now in the NFL now. That's theoretically watering down your product, and yet somehow that league has kind of endured some of that through some of that. So do I think that Georgia and the rest of college football could tolerate, a few more freshmen playing, a few more players that are probably not quite at the same level that maybe Georgia had in 2021 and 2022? I think it probably could. Yard Dog says, besides Ohio State, I wouldn't say that I saw an elite team this year. I think that's true, but also in the case of Ohio State, the notion that they're an elite team is a relatively new phenomenon because as recently as the beginning of December, nobody was saying that. That's how quickly things can change. So I see in all three of our comment sections, the ones we read, there's always the comment saying, well, as long as they got Mike Bobo, they're not going to win anything. Maybe you're right, but most of us are not that impressed with your ability to predict the future. And I'm just being honest. I love you. I'm glad that you're here. I hope you'll choose to be a part of our comment section. This is not directed at any one person. This is directed to a good number of people who are saying something similar. Most of us just aren't as impressed with your ability to predict the future. As I said before, be very wary of what might be true in the future that doesn't seem true today. Now, sometimes things do work out the way you expect them to, but college football is also a sport that has a way of surprising us. So just keep that in mind. Devil Dog says, if we can't win the money game, we are left to have to win the coaching game. We've got some issues there. Well, the one thing that's definitely true is every coach in America, whether it be Kirby Smart or Ryan Day or anybody else, every coach in America is going to have to coach around some issues. Notre Dame probably had to do that last night with a crop of Buckeye receivers they knew they really couldn't run step for step with. They knew that was going to be an issue for them. They're trying their best to kind of coach around that. Every team is going to have to coach around some of that kind of stuff. Declan Miller says it's minus 7 degrees in Chicago right now. Boy, that is cold. My gosh, that's cold, Declan. Wow. G. Gray said it was 8 degrees in Athens at 7 a.m. That is cold, too. Whew. All right. Let's see what else. Anything else before we go? Foster Moss says, what did I wear to the game last night? I bundled up last night a little bit like I am right now. Why didn't I say that I was going? I don't know why I didn't say that. So, I don't know. I figure you don't really care, about stuff like that. Michael Clayton said, talk about being wrong. Yeah, he talks about my Jaden Daniels prediction. I don't think that, hopefully that's the wrongest I'll ever be about anything because at no point in time did I see any of that coming with Jaden Daniels. It was very open and clear about it. One of the things I try to be is excessively clear. I tried to be. And that's a huge problem when you get it really wrong because your wrongness is unmistakable. I said matter-of-factly prior to the 2022 season that I thought that LSU could be a playoff team if they would bench Jaden Daniels and play Garrett Nussmeier instead. Now, I think there's a chance that Nussmeier still is probably a good quarterback, although this year was a little bit disappointing for him. But the idea that Daniels was going to be essentially the best young quarterback in the sport, which he very well might be right now, Michael, yeah, you better believe that's about as wrong as I think I've probably ever been about anything. At least I hope so anyway. All right, we got to go. Good stuff. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. Heating system, talk about being really cold right now. How about getting that thing tuned back up to factory fresh specs, be ready to go. RS Andrews got you on that. Find them online, rsandrews.com. All right, y'all stay warm. Have a great day. Back here tomorrow. If it snows, maybe we'll be at home, but hopefully we'll be able to figure all that out. So we'll see you then. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.